You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. That was Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. Over and over announcing your place in the family of things. Letting the soft animal of your body love what it loves. What a beautiful way to speak to this kind of wholeness, this holing of the self, the queering of the self, the wilding of the self, the undomesticating of the self, and through that, and through holding that as a stance in relationship, rewilding or holing or queering our culture, weaving a cultural imagination that holds more of our own wholeness and who we are. And that's a beautiful piece and a beautiful frame for today's conversation with my dear friend and brother Henry Fowkes, who I share space with here in Melbourne, Victoria, Wurundjeri country. And Henry is an internationally accredited and renowned open floor movement teacher, and he's a brilliant group facilitator and lead facilitator at the groupwork centre here in Melbourne. A facilitator and a holder of space that I've admired for many years. We've known each other, I think we were saying about 10 years, very loosely. And he's someone that I've admired for his deep authenticity and, just real, I suppose, grittiness and realness that he shows up on the facilitation floor with all peoples. And so in this episode, we explore facilitation as the art of kind of weaving wholeness into relationship, of weaving wholeness into our cultural fabric and holding space for our wholeness. And we explore it formally as, I suppose, as an art form, facilitation, for those who maybe do professionally facilitate, or those who are just in relationship, as we all are, and facilitate. And those who are just wanting to deepen their ability to hold space for wholeness and to really be in relationship to the field. And so we talk about the idea that there is no such thing as a real safe space, as is kind of often spoken about in these places. How do you create safe space? But the idea of a safer space, or the idea for a space for a safe emergency, as Fritz Perls calls it, a kind of safe risk-taking, because there's always a risk that's necessary in our kind of transformation and transfiguration work. And so how do we create space that's not necessarily safe, but at least a little bit safer for those kind of emergencies and risk-taking? The role of validation in group work, co-regulation. We also explore Martin Buber's I-thou philosophy and how being in relationship to the thou, or the us, the we, helps us be in relationship to the field of the room and have a kind of genuine conversation with the room. And the facilitation can in many ways be seen and felt as just a real conversation between one-to-one or one-to-many. And when we come from that stance, we're able to bring a deeper authenticity and drop out of kind of role-making or role-taking. We also talk about working with power differentials in the rooms and those roles, and how we can hold the whole, or be in relationship to the mystery and the unknown with a sense of comfort in the room. Plus many, many more things. It's quite a deep dive into the art of facilitation and philosophy of facilitation, and how that shows up both, as I said, professionally as a facilitator, but also as we facilitate our way through the relationships that we're all very much entwined and dependent upon. And so how can we bring this stance and this art of facilitation and holding space for wholeness, for being in relationship to the thou, into all of our relationships? And so this is a brilliant one. There's also some lovely resources in there. And Henry's always full of stories and cackles and laughter. So I hope you enjoy. Do make sure you check out the resources afterwards. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts, your feelings, your reflections on the other side. Grab a tea, take a breath. Notice the inhale, the exhale, and the space between. A moment in between moments. Here you are. You're listening to Spaces Between with your friend and host, Al Jeffrey. An open exploration into restoring connection in the 21st century, in our personal lives, our relationships, and our communities. What does it mean to live in relationship to the wholeness of who we are together? My guess is that you're somewhat like me and that you feel the impact of a great disconnect in a very real, a very personal, and a very collective way. And they also feel the call, the invitation to participate in what Joanna Macy calls the great turning, to restore relationship, wholeness, and connection, and to support the regeneration of consciousness and culture, all in service to weaving the Giles Eisenstein calls the more beautiful world our hearts know is possible. I'm also going to guess that you're already doing this work in your very own way, so thank you. And Spaces Between is really a platform and a community building tool for an open inquiry into these questions to support you, to support me, and to support us in this very remembering of who we are together. Maybe how can we queer our minds? How can we de-domesticate, rewild our minds, and restore a relational way of being with ourselves and with each other? And to renew a culture that tends to the whole from the inside out. That's what we're here for, my friends. Now, I'm not one for ads and am one, though, for creating something beautiful with others, in this case, you. So I do invite you to be part of the magic. If you enjoy our time together, if you gain nourishment from these conversations, and make sure to subscribe Spotify and Apple Podcasts and rate the show and even leave a review. Leaving a rating or a written review on Apple Podcasts really helps those who stumble across the show to choose to lean in and try an episode and drink from these waters. It also really helps enroll the next juicy guest that we're going to have on the show. So do go ahead and leave a written review and definitely rate on Apple Podcasts if you can. And if you're feeling super generous and fueled and filled up by our conversations, you might even consider donating or soon joining my community membership. You can head over to www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com for all of that, all of the show notes, and lots more. For now, this is it. Let's dive in. Henry, so good to have you on the podcast, sitting opposite me in my bedroom. First time that, I've had someone on the show sitting in my space, so thanks for joining.
Pleasure. Great to be here.
Yeah, we've had, for those listening in, we've attempted to record the podcast maybe 3 times, and every time just ended up having a great hang and chat, which could have been and would have been a beautiful podcast anyway. But I'm glad we now have a microphone between us, so we can see what emerges.
Yeah, we can include this beautiful black microphone in the conversation.
Yeah. So maybe let's just begin by doing a little check-in. And for those tuning in, as usual, whether this is the first time you're taking a moment to tune in today or this evening or not, just taking another moment. We can close our eyes just for a moment and turn our gaze towards the inner world. And just maybe noting physically, emotionally, what we're feeling. And Henry, if you're willing to go first, just, seeing how we're showing up together.
Noticing just a spaciousness in that invitation to slow down and check in. I can really feel the warmth of the licorice tea we've just been drinking in my mouth and down into my belly, which is really lovely and grounding. And a bit of dryness in my face. But also a sense of excitement, just hearing my voice and the tones of that are going to be shared in this conversation with you and to anyone who's listening. So feeling actually really excited about this conversation and whatever emerges in this space. So
Cute. I'm feeling physically quite limber, actually, quite mobile, malleable, loosey-goosey. I'm looking for there's a bit of tension in my lower back, but relative to how it has been, it's feeling quite free. Emotionally, there were layers of maybe, anxiety and feeling a bit rushed to like set this up after our time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And just curious about what will happen when we click record and like how it might be different to just hanging out on the deck before. So very curious, very grateful, and excited for what will emerge or re-emerge that we've noted on before, that we want to kind of pull the thread on a little bit more again. So I'm here and I'm in. Thanks for joining.
Beautiful. Such a pleasure.
Yeah. And we've known each other since, what were we reflecting? At least 5 years?
At least 5 years. I thought the first time I remember us at least crossing paths was closer to 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe 8. Maybe something like 8 years ago when I just moved to Melbourne.
Yeah.
We crossed on a conference call.
Yeah. Very different Al back then. Actually, I would have been Alex back then, I imagine.
Yeah, you were.
Yeah.
Thanks. And then probably crossed paths closer over, probably the last 5 years.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of our interweaving in the last couple of years has been through facilitation and dance and just community gathering. And so I suppose, to set the frame for our conversation, obviously within the broader inquiry of the podcast of restoring wholeness in self and society. So curious about your experience of facilitation and facilitating and the real inner workings and interworkings of that. And also somatics and movement and how that plays into the work of facilitating and holding space for growth and resilience and community. So look forward to diving into those spaces.
Yeah.
But to contextualize that first, I suppose a little bit about your story. Obviously studying engineering. I suppose more specifically curious about the shift from engineering to the work that you now do in facilitation and open floor movement practice. What were your experience of either lack of embodiment or lack of community that led you to now really wanting to contribute in this way?
Yeah, the context is that I was studying civil engineering in Tassie as a young pup. Out of school, I went and studied. I didn't know what to do. And my parents are both in the sciences. Dad's a vet, Mum did a PhD in chemistry. Right. So I was pretty good at maths and didn't mind science, and so engineering seemed to be apparently a good thing to do. And so I studied engineering in Tassie, and it was an interesting journey, but it was very complex about what an engineer actually was, and very cool problem solving aspects to it. But I think for me, I struggled a lot with looking back, a lot of anxiety and maybe even and struggles with confidence and self-doubt as well. And so for me, engineering was a weird place to learn and to feel really stressed. A lot of computers, very analytical. And so I guess I got into embodiment through yoga during engineering. That's some of my reflections. It would have been 10, 15 years ago. And just noticing these moments of inner peace or like calm and not wanting them to leave. Noticing as soon as I went home to my share house, something would happen and then I'd feel this uncomfortable feeling again. I'd be annoyed. And I really remember those memories. And I guess throughout engineering, towards the end of it, I guess I figured out I didn't want to be an engineer. And I kind of got into community projects and a bunch of volunteer work, and that gave me amazing opportunities for leadership and community. And so through that, I'd never felt a connection with like-minded people. And through a few projects and having opportunities to lead, I just kind of thrived and I loved it. And just being able to, I've always been a very collaborative kind of leader and don't like to be the center of attention, but love to guide and support and work with people. So, in my final few years of uni, I did a lot of volunteering through an organisation called the Oak Tree Foundation, and I led a bunch of campaigns and just got into this facilitation thing. And I seemed to be good at it, and then I trained people in it, and I just loved it. And I think ever since then, after kind of finishing engineering, I probably just called myself professionally a facilitator. I wasn't doing the engineering thing, so I had to hang on to something, my professional identity, and I feel like that just kind of led me into facilitating groups with young people. And then also through a lot of my battles with my anxiety, my inner world, I got into dance. as a movement practice, as a meditation, as a place of expression, because words never seem to cut it for me in regards to, sharing my insides with the outer world. And so, that just kind of kept leading me. I got into dance also to become a better facilitator, and that's sort of been the common thread of my professional life as well. And struck by the sense of community and those experiences I've had through those realms is definitely what inspires me to share that with the world more.
Yeah. It sounds like quite a just soft, and I mean, just through that beautiful articulation, sounds like a kind of organic, almost easeful, graceful meandering towards who you are now, with facilitation being quite the core. And I've definitely witnessed you as a beautifully natural facilitator. And I suppose within, the kind of inquiry of restoring wholeness in self and society, how would you describe facilitation as a practice? And what does it have to offer our time?
Great question. I think for me, facilitation as a practice is a practice of embracing our wholeness. It is, for me, to be able to show up and be as embracing of whatever shows up in a group, which is wildly complex and as complex as me, is that the more I can embrace myself and the many aspects of myself and my past and my desires and longings and fears, then the more I can show up with a group. And I found therefore, being a facilitator has been such a place for me to learn and grow. And that the more and more I develop as a facilitator, the more I guess it gets simpler, in that it's basically having a conversation with multiple people. And I think in this time, to be able to have deep, rich conversations is something that we're so hungry for, and they're so needed. We seem to be a bit more and more polarized. And now with COVID, we're on our technology so much more. So we're so much more distant than we used to be. And in some ways, people say about online and how much it takes away so much. At the same time, there's so many more longings and desires and things focused on this screen. So we need to listen more deeply than ever before. And so I think for me in these times, collaboration and the abilities of relating with humans is something that's more important. It's as important as ever before, but it's not going to get any more simple. And we're going to need to work together more and more. So it just seems to be something that's so needed.
And I think we were speaking in one of our earlier attempts just about that it's fundamentally the art of relationship, whether it's one-to-one, one-to-many. Fundamentally, it's grappling with the same kind of paradoxes that emerge in, say, intimate romantic relationship around discerning self and other and world and meaning-making in group scenarios. Very similar challenges, just with obviously different nuances, which in a complex world, and we relate in possibly more complex ways, or there's more complexity to the ways we relate now than ever. So we kind of require more complex skills. And so, for me, facilitation or the practice is kind of becoming more, as Esther Perel would say, what did she call it? Just relational intelligence, essentially. And so, I suppose to begin, group work, and I mean, there's so much talk, I think, to name or just dive into one aspect that is quite key, the idea of safe space or safer space or brave space and psychological safety, which is so loud among discourse, whether it's in the corporate arena or just in the facilitation space. How do you create safe space or safer space? What are some of the things that you've learned in doing that, whether they're quite templated, or maybe what are some of the things that we very rarely hear about that you've kind of found your own personal groove in?
Interesting question. It does make me think of just how we talk about that, of creating a safe space. And I know a lot of my teachers, as you kind of alluded to there, that this, that's like I encourage you hard, one of my open floor teachers, there's no such thing as creating a safe space, as safe as possible. And there's something really incredible, that learning edge of safety. Fritz Perls in Gestalt therapy, he's called it the safe emergency. And I resonate with that of groups, of this vibrancy sometimes where you're at that point of safety as a kind of side point. And I think for me, the way I think about creating group safety these days is so much around, the first thing that comes to mind is around belonging and creating a place where we can feel somewhat embraced for who we are and how we are. And so a lot of it is trying to kind of break up group dynamics to support us to soften our breathing into our bellies and to soften our shoulders in the physical, and to sometimes take some little risks, to really, I guess something that I would do to create that sense of belonging is to take some little risks in a group. And then it's like each time asking ourselves, like, am I safe to be here? Am I safe to be here? And so I think I do that in many ways. Now I use dance and movement quite a lot as a way of breaking up a space which somehow seems to support us to feel calmer and more, I guess the alertness goes down just from an act of even walking through a space together.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that sense of groupness and belonging is something that really comes to mind how I work now. And also just as a facilitator, really listening for the details at the start, like the things which sometimes when I was maybe younger, if I was really rushed, I'd miss, for example, how important it is to really greet people warmly and how much that supports people to feel so much more relaxed, and how you really validate each person as they do, the first voice in the room, like how important that is to setting the tone. So a lot of these kind of simpler pieces now of relationship and warmth, I feel, are things that I probably orient more towards now, rather than more complex processes and the ways of thinking about it.
Yeah, which just sounds like radical authenticity as the facilitator, like really stepping off the platform of your role a little bit and into just being human and being genuinely interested in the people that are coming in the door. So actually being willing to go up and say, hey, rather than being kind of stuck in going through your run sheet or being like out the back, just making sure all the tech's set up or whatever it is, like actually focusing on the humans.
For sure. It gets me thinking about working with teenagers and how I remember quite early on realizing that how to engage them quickly, especially the ones who I feel resistance towards. If there's someone I'm like, oh, I'm a bit scared to talk to you for some reason in my makeup, for them to really try and gently engage them and to create some relationality, because they can be the people who in some way unconsciously I might be disengaging more and more or taking my attention. So just thinking about those kind of things of connecting to all the voices in the room.
Yeah. And I suppose it's, well, for me, what comes up is just the deeply reciprocal nature of that. Because for me, I very consciously connect with the people in the room also so that I feel like I belong. And so it's not just to create safety for them in quotation marks, but for me. So I debunk this kind of role that I'm stepping into, and there's a real sense of sameness here. And so I do make sure I go up and, welcome everyone and get to know them. And just so when I look around the room, I feel people's eyes as well, not just seeing them. And so I suppose just, really feel that the reciprocation of it all. And that these aren't just things we do like for them as the consumers of our facilitation.
It's beautiful. Yeah, and lovely to hear your, I love that idea of you not being so stuck to this role where you're, and somehow then you can have power, a lot of power over the participants in some way, but then different roles play out where if you can actually create a relationship, I was just a human like me. Henry's just a messy human like me. It also creates this sense of self-responsibility. And because, if I just say anything at you, I actually know it's going to impact you just like it would impact me in some way, thinking about how the participants might think about it, but also just not playing out those roles so easily.
Yeah, not to create them in this space. Like maybe in some of the contexts we both work in, we're actually here to not add more roles to the kind of broader pie of the organizational team or whatever it is, but work with the ones that may already be existing but aren't helping or supportive or productive. And so for us to come in and to create more roles really doesn't seem productive. And I know for me, it's just it's mainly with keynote speaking. Like I always try and connect with a few people in the audience just so I can look out and feel sameness and like I belong. But so plays out in facilitation as well when you're on the floor with people. Because for me, if there's no sense of, or if there is a sense of me feeling other than them, then there might be shadowy expressions that come out of me in order to feel significant or to feel like I'm worthy because I'm sharing, I don't know, well-articulated statements that are witty and whatever. So I feel like there's a humility that comes from just like actually connecting to someone really authentically.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
And then you find that, say, in public speaking, that really helps you to drop into that conversation with them in a more intimate way? Or
just with more realness, which I suppose, brings me to, I suppose, the question we were exploring of authenticity and professionalism and discerning that line of, like, sure, sometimes it's just not the right moment to be totally authentic and share exactly how and who you are. And sometimes you need to in order to welcome a deeper, like, sense of being human together. Yeah, how do you experience that kind of dance between authenticity and professionalism?
Yeah, it's a really interesting a dance and a conversation of one piece. I remember growing up, it's almost like when you work or go to work, I remember being told of like, you leave your personal life at the door and feeling how impossible that was. And I know for me, it just seemed like an impossible task. And then on the other side of things, seeing people and witnessing really totally wearing your heart on their sleeve and just expressing whatever emerges within my experience. And that is also quite hard to deal with. And it's in a facilitator context. I remember we were talking about what going to an event or going to a dance class or a workshop, and how much you want to know that the facilitator can hold themselves in regards to being able to hold their experience. And I think that that's something that I really stand by, of being able to not throw my emotional baggage out there to be needed to be held by the group. And saying that there's like, if I hold all my feelings and my humanness inside, and I'm just like this stone statue, well, then how can anyone relate to me? You know, I'm just a canvas for projection and for transference, or all these things, like power dynamics. So I remember we grappled with this when we talked last time, and there's no set formula, but there's definitely an awareness. What's that?
I want an answer. Give me.
When I think about an answer, I think of like a continuum. If you had put those two on a continuum of like authenticity at one end, and let's just go with professionalism at the other. And authenticity being, I just freely express everything that's going on in my human experience, which could even be projections. They could be judgments. They can be desires, you know, that's one. Yeah. And then the other end, let's say professionalism, is holding it all in and being the role. For me, like, being the role is more pendulating between the two, and even maybe somewhere in the middle, where it's like I'm able to be aware of what's going on for me, and I'm also able to hold myself in this role. But I definitely feel like when I've started to share more of my humanness, it's created more dynamic and connected group experiences, because something in you connects to me that instantly makes you feel safer, I think, in just that humanness.
Yeah.
So, I think maybe we can play with that as a continuum. How does that resonate with you?
That's great. We can work on it. There's part of me that wants to reframe, like, the word professionalism to more maybe just retroflexion or repression. So it's kind of what's just coming up is kind of replacing the words around authenticity and repression or retroflexion, or expression and retroflexion. And that actually professionalism, in my eyes, is actually the ability to hold both of those. And to, like, for me, that's the true professional, as maybe Margaret Wheatley would call them, the more gracious, courageous leader who can be both expressive and radically authentic, and, you know, not repress, but retroflect, or to be with themselves when need be as well. Yeah, so part of me wants to just kind of note that professionalism actually doesn't have to be the opposite of authenticity. It can really include it.
I love that. Definitely resonate with that.
Yeah.
And that makes sense, doesn't it? If authenticity is an outwards expression, retroflection is an inwards. And it's helpful as like a way of adjusting to the world, of regulating. Sometimes it's really important to hold what's going on inside on, and to really, sometimes I am my greatest support. You know, to be able to sit with this and know how to regulate and how to ground when I've been deeply stirred by someone in a group or something someone said. I feel like that's really important. Skill as a facilitator and a human. But equally as important to share, like when we are moved, and to share in that heartfelt way of acknowledging. Because I like that distinction, because professionalism can sometimes be very dry and very almost analytical or emotionless. We see both of us, it's like we're cringing at it.
It's like, yuck. And I'm just relating it to, you know, another one of the grand paradoxes around our dependency and our independence. And of course, ultimately, we're all kind of attempting towards some kind of interdependency. But to be dependent possibly is to be more, or to fall more into our dependency is possibly more to be more authentic, to let people into our inner world, to be held. And then to be independent is to like hold their own ship and to just like keep it in and deal with it ourselves, and to be able to play the polarities. And, you know, I can be deeply independent when I need to be, and also deeply dependent when I need to be, and also hopefully discern when I should be in one or the other. What are some of the, I suppose, tools then in discerning for you? Like, how do you read the room? We talk about collective intelligence and the beauty and the magic in the room we were speaking about. How is it that you're in relationship to that field, that magic in the room? How do you feel it and work with it?
Like, just even in that moment, I think sometimes for me it is just to pause, to notice what's going on for me. And I think sometimes not even to notice anything specific other than just to get present, and to watch my own judgments and to watch my own inner critiquing just to soften into the background or into my back body, as we often say in open floor. And then often it is very much that whimsical, like the vibe, like how are we going? Like how does the space feel between me and the group? How does the space kind of feel between others? I think I often am looking at how am I relating, feeling with them, how are they relating with each other. So often that's a lot of the cues that I will look for. If it's on a dance floor, it's pretty obvious because it shows up in the bodies really in an obvious way, from everyone's on the ground or in their own gel to like people really bouncing and wanting to be out and wanting to connect, or connection thing. So looking at, depending on what people are hungry for, when you look at that, you said that dependency and independency, or it's often, you know, it's like we can come wanting solitude or connection, like these hungers, you know, before we call the 4 hungers of solitude or connection. We might be hungry for belonging, you know, wanting that to be part of that group body, or sometimes really longing for spirit, and you feel that spiritedness. So often I feel like it's that lens of connectedness I look for, and then often I'll try and get me in the conversation. Sometimes, you know, this is as a facilitator, even in a conversation where I feel like I'm kind of out of the conversation going on. So I do my best to get myself in there, whether or not it's to dance on a floor, whether or not it's just to ask a question, whether or not it's to share a little bit, just to make sure I'm an active participant in it. And then I feel, for me, it's easier to feel into what's going on once I'm in the conversation. Otherwise, I'm just thinking about it. So a lot of it for me is probably hacking into my body and my feelings more. I
definitely resonate with that. Notice when there's, for me, sometimes, depending on the group, like if I feel a little bit daunted by the group, or which for me is usually when they're like older white men, then I'll definitely sit on the outside, and that's my safe place. But then I just can't calibrate and like really get into the magic. So I definitely resonate with that piece around actually just entering the conversation. And I enjoy just the notion of just thinking of it as a conversation. Very David White of you, Henry. But it's just with a bunch of complex humans rather than just one-on-one or,
What does he call it? He calls it, David White used a lot of language around like the frontier, like the beckoning frontier and the alive conversation. You're about to go into a nice David White accent there.
Yeah.
But that aliveness in the conversation interaction is what also brings me joy. When there's a deadness in a group, that's sort of often when I've got trying to put my curiosity, antennas out there of like, well, what's going on here? And not in a way of me trying to figure it all out myself, but actually with the group, whether or not it's to ask them that specific question. How are we going? What's going on? Or if it's to kind of play with it in different ways of changing dynamics and working together. But I know it's interesting reflecting is that the more and more I facilitate, the more it's like I try and give back responsibility to the group as well to be a self-regulating organism who are creative beyond measure and can learn so much. And that I'm an active member in that versus me being the one to figure everything out, to have all the wisdom. I love that principle of the wisdom's in the group. Somehow it relieves me of this burdensome thing of needing to be the all-knowing oracle or the guru. I think we passed the time, in the future, it feels like we definitely passed the time of the guru. And we're more into this space of collective, collaboration, collective, just more of the collective.
I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh that said the next Buddha will be a Sangha. Yeah, and I definitely feel that, like the complexity of the challenges that we're facing, if we are to actually, innovate and to push the frontier, then it's going to take much more than a single genius. Not that, I also like the idea there's no such thing as a solo genius. It's the kind of the genius, the collective genius. And so the ability to facilitate and hold these spaces for collective intelligence and magic and, collaboration ultimately feels super important. Yeah, there's something else you said about I suppose it was, it's gone. Around the field, and we've spoken about Martin Buber and I, thou. And how do you feel the I, thou? Or maybe firstly, just love to hear your perception of I, thou. What is I, thou, and how does it show up in facilitation?
I guess quite simply for me, from the little of Buber's work I know is I, thou is more of a being in relationship. And it's more of a being with, if we're talking in the context of a conversation, it's a being with me as a whole being with you here. And then it is more of the doing, the thinking, the conceptualizing, analyzing. Also very important, much different way of relating. And so for me, the I, thou is very much, that me being with me and all my humanness, and then being in presence with you and yours. And seeing what emerges in that space between. Yeah.
Brilliant. Little plug, space between. So being, it sounds like being very aware of where, like, your whole self and all of that carries all of the parts, and acknowledging that there's something just as complex in the room and in the other maybe, and being curious about that interplay between the kind of,
and plug for space between. And I feel like, there's a reason you're excited.
Check it out, by the way, if you're listening.
But the space between is very much where, for me, the richness happens. And that I could be telling you all these ideas and thoughts, and there's something that separates me from you when I do that. It can be important as part of an intellectualizing process. And there's something that happens which is magical when we show up and inhabit the space between. And it can be very vulnerable and rich, and it's not something we principally do in our culture. Like, we often do a lot to avoid the intimacy of presence, being in the here and now. And And I know for me that is the richness. And the other thing that could happen in this conversation is I could tell you all the cool things and the quotes I know, and you could say all the cool things you know. And I'm sure we've all been in those conversations before where it feels like you're in two monologues going on.
Yeah.
And I'm sure your listeners have had that experience where it's like,
a bit of a competition of,
yeah, who knows the most, or like you're just not feeling met. I share a story and you share a story of you, which can sometimes be an incredibly regenerative, flowing conversation. Other times you can just feel like we're on separate islands.
Yeah. Yeah. Somehow there's almost a sadness that comes up for me just in visualizing that. Two islands, and we're trying so hard to connect, but they're just in these ways that are so not connective. Like they're conceptual, and like intimacy is, well, as far as I know it, is kind of a sharing of our interiority, of our interior worlds. Like when I feel intimate with someone, I feel like I'm let in to a degree to their interior world. But yeah, this kind of competition of word naming or whatever just doesn't allow that. But I feel such a sadness in just how often that's the attempt.
For sure. Yeah, I hear it is sad. And it's a sad because for me, it feels like it leaves behind a huge part of our humanness. And I remember being described around, there's I, thou, I, it, and then I, ghost is how that was described in something I read once. And for me, there's something very truthful in that. There's like a ghostly like nature of, am I even here? You know, when you're in a conversation and you're like, am I here? Are you here? Are we just talking to Siri?
Yeah. I've heard it also described as a kind of ambiguous loss. Like you can be on two pillows, and I'm pointing at my bed, by the way, because we're in my bedroom, I'll say again. You can be lying next to each other, but feel miles and miles apart. And so there's this kind of ambiguous sense of loss and distance. But it doesn't make sense because you're right here, so you should feel so connected, which is just like sitting on your phones at the dinner table, or there's this kind of profound ambiguous loss and distance that we feel in this hyper-connected yet deeply fragmented world that we're in.
I feel like the melancholic clouds have just surrounded us.
Yeah. Let's swim in them for a while. What are the four? I was curious about the four hungers that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Could you speak just a little bit more about
so
that?
They're from one of the maps in open floor movement practice. And the four hungers, and the notion is that we are always in relationship. It's kind of underpinning a principle of open floor movement practice. And I really resonate with that. It's like we're always in relationship with ourselves, with each other, with the natural world, with the animals, you know, with the cosmos. Like we're always in relationship. And so for me, it's like that relationship on a continuum. Those hungers kind of vary at different points of the day, in the week, in the month, in lifetimes. And so the four is the hunger for solitude, that hunger for being with ourselves, and that time and space. I know my friends have just had kids recently. They're hungry for this solitude of just being with them in their space, in their body. The hunger for connection, that one-on-one connection that nothing else kind of quite hits that hunger for me, like that intimacy of a deep conversation or a partner or a friend. And then there's the hunger for belonging, that wanting to be in the tribe, in the group, you know, is that longing to belong. And then that hunger for spirit, that like whatever resonates with us, that thing that's bigger beyond us, the question mark, the cosmos, the nature, whatever we kind of hang our ideas of that onto that, or whatever we identify resonates with that. But that hunger for something greater than me and this little human. And I find it really fascinating. It's just like a check-in point with myself of like, what am I feeling hungry for at this time in my life? And really underneath that is like, what do I need? What feels supportive for me right now? Where am I? Where could I get more support in my life?
Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Definitely feel for me it's solitude at the moment.
Yeah.
Just going through, I'm like, no, I feel very connected to you right now. This is great. Definitely feel like I belong. Coming into winter, it feels right. But I love that as a frame to check in on. And as we were talking about it initially, to kind of read a room or to get a sense of a room, whether it's that there's a kind of collective field of spirit and everyone's feeling really transcendent and uplifted, or there's a few people that are just like, you can really sense that they're in or maybe transitioning to solitude. It's a nice marker. Yeah.
And solitude's funny because it's something I think we often, I guess, we've confused with aloneness. It's like you can sometimes have incredible solitude and be in a group. You can hang out with your friends and just be with yourself.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting one of solitude. I used to think it was very much going to a cave.
Yeah.
That idea or that kind of fantasy. What do you envisage your solitude to look like?
Yeah. Well, for me, I also just want to note the idea or the possible notion that sometimes to be alone can feel like an act against the others as well, which is just another possible myth to sit with and to ponder. But yeah, for me, solitude just feels like slow, long walks. And like during lockdown last year, I loved just walking and maybe listening to a podcast, or maybe just listening to a podcast of our natural environment and really landing and feeling. I suppose solitude for me ultimately also feeds my hunger for belonging, because I, as David Whyte might say, drink from a deeper well and find a deeper sense of belonging beyond my human belonging, which I find deeply healing. Yeah, so long walks, long sits, lots of writing, lots of poetry. That's my kind of solitude.
Beautiful. Sounds very enriching. Kind of sense of a settling. I kind of get just hearing you like that, maybe
an arrival.
Yeah, and solitude does support us to settle into our skin and, belong more to the skin we're in, which, Brene Brown, her words, true belonging is the opposite of fitting in, which is a degree in which we can embrace ourselves, that we'll actually feel a true sense of belonging. And it resonates for me, being in groups. It's like I might not actually agree with a lot of the values of many people on a dance floor in a group. Yeah. But in some ways it doesn't matter. If we can agree on certain principles of being here in a respectful, kind way and embracing the differences allowed, I've had an incredible experience of belonging. Yeah. So,
and the ability to ask for that in a group. Just like, cool, you might be going out dancing or something, just to say, hey, I just actually need to take a moment before we get in there because it sounds like it's pumping. I'm actually just going to sit outside for a while and to really ask that, and the courage to ask for solitude as well. To let yourself be alone, and then the grace and compassion to let somebody else be alone as well is a beautiful thing. And so I wonder how that plays back to facilitation. The ability for us as facilitators, which I would regard everyone, we're always kind of facilitating, just kind of...
Sure, we're always in conversation.
What and how is kind of the question. But the ability to, I suppose, land and acknowledge these, just working with these four hungers again within ourselves, to then be able to hold that space and, really be the kind of the gracious leader in the room, the one that can make it so safe for somebody just to sit out if they want to, or... Because a lot of it for me, I really notice it in other facilitators, the tone. It's you can use nice words that you've learnt in a facilitation training, or you've read on an article, 7 steps to group work or something, and you can use that templated word, but the tone for me and your body, of course, all the para and nonverbal cues speak about really how safe you feel as a facilitator.
Yeah, it's kind of like the soundtrack and the title of the music just don't match.
Yeah.
And the one line I often think about that is that it's not necessarily the words we say, but how we say it. It's so powerful.
Yeah. And so as a facilitator, starting to bring it down to maybe some not practicals, but just some things that those listening, I mean, many listeners are either facilitators already or just fascinated by, deepening their ability to hold space, whether it's, again, in intimate relationship or with just their colleagues, or whether it is that they do run workshops. What are some of the less spoken about aspects of facilitation that you've really come to value and that you see in, say, your mentors and teachers? And what are the things that you don't tend to see in the kind of 7 steps to skilled facilitation?
Often, the first piece that comes to mind is that emotional intelligence piece, which I think we've been unpacking in different ways and words. my great teachers, Glen Oka, she used to say, first facilitate thyself. It's like a principle. And so I feel like part of that is that before, and when you're saying it's not necessarily the words, but how you say it, for me, it's very much about us being able to facilitate ourselves, get to know ourselves, get curious about what stirs us and what kind of people do we like being around and what do we struggle with. What's our relationship with different emotions? You know, which people are we kind of fearful of showing up in groups? So there's that piece of knowing ourselves. And then I feel like maybe one of the things which gets left behind is the power of validation and the power of really not needing to agree or disagree with people, but just, you know, to confirm their existence, to validate that what they've said is worthy. It is. It's been heard. And that is so much a whole body game.
Yeah.
Like you've said, if I just go, I hear you, I understand. People throw those as one-liners. I think it's so much more than here's the 5 one-liners. It's so much about our embodied ability to deeply listen and our ability to validate. Often facilitating, in my experience, is we can get so focused on the process and forget about the foundational pieces. And so it's more like, you know, I've heard like 80-20%. Maybe the focus should be on 20% processes, 80% on the foundation. And so much of that is, for me, that self-awareness, facilitating ourselves, validating, and then being curious to actually hand the space over to the other for giving our wisdom or our opinions. And so to just ask questions like, can you say more about that? Or I'm wondering if you could say more. Or if we don't understand and we feel defensive, before we jump into defending or disagreeing, to actually just go, wow, to gently put it back to them like, I feel really stirred by what you've said. I'm wondering if you can just say more about that just to see if I can understand, or can you say a bit more to help me understand? So there's a different stance to you saying something and me needing to hold it or capture all the content, which I also think sometimes gets a bit caught up in facilitation of, you know, the facilitator will summarize all the words you say, or the therapist. And it's like they're just repeating back everything you've said. And it can be quite anxiety-provoking. You're like, I see what you're doing. You were listening and dotting all the points down. But you can lose a real flow in creativity. So, simplicity and just giving the space back to the group, back to the individuals, I think is a really powerful skill as a facilitator. That's maybe not spoken about as much.
Yeah. And I think in my experience, it really models the kind of relationship that, I mean, for me, my facilitation is ultimately around fostering kind of relational intelligence and an ability to hold greater space for wholeness. And so it feels really wrong for me to focus 80% on process and 20% on relationship, because what I'm actually hoping to not achieve, but make space for in the room is relationship. And so those moments where it doesn't go to plan, but you really, you do give the power stick back to the room and become curious about it together, and it gets a bit messy, but then everyone goes through this moment of that was the work. We didn't just talk about it and go through a planned process. We actually just did the fucking work. And it's real and it's here and now and we all feel it in our bodies. So I love that and those moments of giving the mic back to the room, essentially.
And it makes you think a lot about the being really clear about the purpose in which we're gathering. So maybe the purpose is it is that people coming to a group because they want to explore this sense of wholeness and interiority, getting to know myself, getting to know us. But the purpose might also be a doing activity, a strategic plan. It might be something like a conflict resolution, which, and I know these spaces can get really interesting with the emotionalities there, but also there's a lot to get done. And so in a really simple way, the facilitator is often the things which are more the relational pieces of just doing a little grounding, a centering, anything, just any kind of pause. Like even that just supports us to be way more present, to be able to relate in a way which is probably a bit wiser or more kind than we would have before. And so that, even those things like a little check-in, a little check-out, are kind of theoretically the first thing we want to leave out because we're in a rush.
Yeah.
But building that sense of group cohesion just so supports, like doing strategic plans. They can be an incredibly frustrating process. They can also be an incredibly creative process if you bring some creativity, some presence as an example of a process.
And play.
Play,
We were talking about pleasure earlier, like the liberating force of play and I suppose activating our kind of more youthful, childlike aspects of self again. Like the potency and power that gives to what can be a really fucking bland strategy. Maybe not add to the strategy, but the process of strategizing.
It's easy to be creative when you're feeling good, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and you're feeling enlivened.
And celebrated.
Yeah.
Like that your ideas are actually adding to something rather than constantly blocked and because we're running out of time or whatever it is.
And it makes you think, as a facilitator, we are setting the marker of the culture. If we're only acknowledging some voices, even in an unspoken way, unconscious way, it fascinates me and horrifies me in groups how you see how the culture just builds often on the person leading, and we're so wired in that way. And so if we can lead in a collaborative spirit, we create that culture amongst a group, and sometimes it works really well. Yeah. Sometimes it doesn't, but we don't necessarily have that control that we like to think we do. Because, humans are messy.
Yeah. And how do you sit with that, I suppose, for me as a man, identifying as a man and presenting as a man, I often feel, not wrong, but something about being, again, the man who's here doing, whether it's a mediation or conflict resolution with a leadership team. And so often there'll be people in the room who are oppressed or their voices are oppressed in the organization. And here I am as another man coming in. And I suppose it comes back to just safety and how quick can we build that safety between, say, myself as a facilitator and whoever it might be that's experiencing oppression in the room to enable this process to actually free that. How do you feel in those spaces? Maybe where there are minority groups in the room, how do you feel within yourself and then how do you meet that?
It can be very complex, and especially in the field conditions in the environment they're in right now at this point in our culture, where language is also, you can wield a lot of power with language. And so as a facilitator, how do we not, like you said, how do I not just play into those dynamics and be another oppressor? And I think for me, some of the things I do is like we said before, create relationships from the moment I get there and to notice my own anxieties. I notice that when I am facilitating in any group, any intersection that is a bit foreign to me, I get nervous. And I think that's a kind of pretty natural human reaction of and so how do I deal with that? I over-prepare and I freak out. But I also feel blessed that I can rest into support of colleagues that can make me feel confident enough that I'm just going to trust myself and bring myself. And then, so to really create those relationships and then to be really clear about that. So I feel like the transparency is one of our greatest tools as a facilitator of just naming things and naming them with curiosity, with kindness. I've worked with groups before and said, I'm not a contact expert in this area, or I might stuff up. I might get things wrong. And then often, most of the time, it really just creates a sense of generosity that I'm human, you're human. And it helps me to just relax. So then I can do better work. If I stuff up, great, well, we can work with it. Yeah. But also, I definitely stand with the principle of equality in groups of supporting all voices to be heard. And that can be really complex dynamic, and sometimes the facilitator, we do need to stand by the loud voices and the quiet voices. But it's complex. Even thinking how, even in this answer, have I kind of spoken around the question a little bit? Because sometimes just creating that kind of comfortable space where you can voice the challenging things. I think actually For me, if the things which are being voiced are challenging, I get more relieved when things aren't getting said. So if people are naming things which are happening for them or that I'm doing, at least you can work with that.
Yeah.
The challenge is where things are silent and that people really aren't willing to talk.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's up to the group. Are they willing to go there?
Yeah.
And so it's actually not my responsibility always as a facilitator to pry or to be the one to do things. You need a willingness to dialogue. I'm talking of Buber.
Yeah.
Buber's work of this idea of for me to be able to be here in relation to you, it does require me to have a willingness to dialogue. And that means a willingness to be changed and a willingness to maybe take a stance that what I think or how I am might not be right. And I think so for me as a facilitator, I guess I try and take that as well because sometimes I might have blind spots.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how can we hold humility and kindness, but also still hold leadership? Because if you've got complex scenarios, you do need some leadership to guide a process.
Yeah.
It's just a roundabout way of some.
Yeah, it's great. I love that second, I'm not even going to call it a tangent, that second, what should we call it? The tourist road, maybe. This was a tourist road. And what I saw on the tourist road, Henry, I loved the willingness to change piece and around humility and, noting Buber's kind of dialogic relationship that all involved will be changed if we're open to it. And if we're not, change will happen, but it might be experienced as pain more so because we're resisting. Who knows? But I love the humility piece that I suppose what's coming to mind is the importance of, as a facilitator, to kind of hold the whole, you might say, or to be in relationship to the unknown and the mystery and to be willing, I suppose for me, the amount to which we're willing to be or we're able to be comfortable and kind of regulated in the unknown and the fucking mess as quite a core kind of skill as a facilitator.
Sure.
To be able to be in like such a messy room potentially and to still be, that kind of graceful leader that can listen and attune and then be the, I think Priya Parker, who wrote The Art of Gathering, speaks about the role of the generous authority.
Yeah. Listen to a great podcast with her and Brene Brown.
Yeah. Which I love. That it's not just always intuitive and we'll just see how it unfolds and we just sit back, and because that can also be really damaging
for sure.
If there are voices in the room that aren't always heard and now are just being trampled all over again. And so to be the generous authority that says, actually, this isn't working. I'm feeling that and I'm going to call it. So I'm wondering if we could blah, blah, blah.
Sometimes we need to say stop, don't we? In many different ways. We need to kind of halt a process or especially when you've got different power dynamics. And and a great point of coming back to ourselves and presence. Even that, in my rambling, it's like when I was in that conversation and I was thinking about all these different scenarios and groups and how do I articulate this, and I'm on a podcast and so it does happen. That happens in groups where we're like sometimes just like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
And we really might not know. And so how can we also slow things down? Because if we're struggling to be present, damn, you can guarantee all of the group or most of the group are too, because groups get heightened. And the whole thing of group think, the group animal kind of can form. And so for us to stay regulated and then support the group to be regulated, it's a whole nother lens, isn't it? If you look at regulation and how do we support people to not be in fight or flight, and not be in defense straight away, to maybe have a sense of, having their social engagement system online, having their ability to feel safe enough here, but also to listen to their own boundaries of like, I don't want to share this right now. And that's another piece that I feel really honouring that more in groups of sometimes that's a massive statement with someone and we don't need to go prying.
Yeah.
We don't need to get them to go deeper or to share more, because I don't feel, for me, authenticity isn't how deep you go necessarily. It's how true you've been. Like, what's true for you right now? It's like an act of truth-telling in words on the dance floor. So that's a very powerful statement to remember to really honour where people are at.
Yeah.
And Yeah. And the groups have got so much going on. The dynamics, if we try and understand it, our heads will explode quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. And what comes up for me is the kind of fixation as a facilitator that I suppose in more, what will I say, maybe spirit or conscious communities, like the more people that cry, the better the workshop that was or whatever. And so the kind of, when the worth of the facilitator gets involved and they need people to like reach a certain point or to have some release or to go to a certain depth. And so if someone's actually not willing to share, then one's own one's own insecurity really comes in and pries away because they've got to get them somewhere. See that quite often.
For sure.
And so again, I suppose it comes back just to humility. And for me, the ability to kind of ride paradox and just be like, actually, that's a beautiful boundary. That's what that is. And maybe there are layers of also guarding, but that's possibly what they need as well. Like we can check that, like just checking if that's beautiful for you to say that. I suppose just want to check if you're totally okay in that, and we can come back later or otherwise not. But not to pride, just to kind of celebrate and mirror maybe. Sure. And allow them to check themselves and produce a kind of self-awareness.
Yeah, because it is paradoxical, isn't it, where if our orientation is that we want to support people to change through quote-unquote depth or going deeper, whatever that is, crying or screaming or whatever, and that's not where they're at. Like there's that in Gestalt theory, they describe it as the paradoxical theory of change. It's like the more we try to change, the more we stay the same. So for me to be really honest with this is where I'm at, and that to be really acknowledged. It's incredible how it's like, wow, then that can create room for change. It's like the more, if I'm standing here full-footed, wholeheartedly in whatever's here, it might be a defense mechanism. Who's to say it's not or hasn't been in the past or isn't right now, a helpful, adjustment, a helpful way of me staying safe. And if it is out of date, maybe being really acknowledged in that moment helps me to drop my guard a little bit. And that doesn't need to be through words. It can just be like a softening, and that can be that can change the course of someone's life in a tiny way.
Yeah.
Through one little interaction or one just moment of being with. Yeah. But it's not as sexy. It's not as euphoric. And don't get me wrong, I love a big dance floor where you just go wild and really go there in like a trancy way. But to know that has its place, but also so does the deep listening and the integrating of those experiences. I feel like state and those kind of big experience of catharsis. Well, we're kind of going in another tangent now.
Go for it. Take me on another tourist.
But kind of from facilitation to dance, but just in regards to our longings to, if you look at the hungers again, if our longing is to support people to go deep or to cry more or to whatever our recollection of depth or healing or whatever the purpose is, the key is if we don't integrate that experience, well, then you're often left, it's tough. You kind of can be left dysregulated or disorientated, and it can leave you more separate from a group. Because, groups are powerful beings in regards to the energetic and the places and spaces they can go, which can be very healing and also very kind of traumatizing or unhelpful.
Yeah, when your kind of everyday known world isn't like that. Or that culture doesn't exist in your intimate friendship group or your relationship. It can actually, it can be quite a mirror. It's quite confronting at first. I remember my first festival in California, which was the last week before I flew back to Melbourne after living in Colorado for 9 months. And it's the first time I've experienced something like Burning Man. It was just, wow. It's like, it's home. And now I'm going to fly back to Melbourne with all my old high school mates and everyone there. And I've just found myself in a totally new way in these 9 months. And straight to quite a strong depression because it just provided this confronting mirror for what could be, but at this current stage definitely was not. And so, there's a real kind of sensitivity that I suppose as facilitators who are providing beautiful group experiences that are very connective and celebratory and validating, to really let that be a slow, hopefully, a slow integration and maybe understand where it is that they're returning to, knowing where they're returning from, and how might we help that aftercare process a little bit more.
For sure, like hearing like that sounds like a big rites of passage for you in that experience. And, you know, if you look at the different bodies of work from rites of passage, Joseph Campbell, you know, the hero's journey is one of the most widely known, but how there is that quest and that journey and to slay the dragon and to get in the underworld. And then you come out and the return. And that is the integration piece. And that often one of the most challenging pieces is that we say this in workshops we do all the time or retreats. Just not make any big decisions in the next couple of weeks because it takes time to integrate. And the other is if you've got a partner or friend or housemates at home, instead of going in sometimes with this, like, your change, this huge expectations or fear or whatever, to first of all just ask them how they're doing. You know, these ways of integrating our experiences in a very human ways because they haven't got the memo. They weren't there. And I feel like sometimes we can get isolated in, like, my first big experience was when I went to Ghana in West Africa when I was 21. I just wanted to get out of my engineering life. And I went there and I was on this quest by myself and it was deeply stressful and I loved it. Like, in hindsight, I was really chasing this, like, rites of passage, this adventure, this kind of moving away from my anxiety and resistance inside. And coming back, I just felt so, like, at home in myself. Never experienced that. But then it was just, I'm not sure if this was similar to your experience, but like asking people, saying, oh, how was it? How was your experience? And then they didn't actually want to listen. Like, they just wanted the dot points and then to talk about something lame or just to drink the next beer.
Yeah.
And so it is something to be aware of. And in our cultures, we do often lack these community structures to support us to integrate or to have the language to articulate it like this. I feel like now maybe me and you can go back to our friends and family and be like, hey, you know, I've had this massive experience. I'm wondering if we can just, you know, just have a chat about it. Or do you want to just go for a walk? Or do you just sit down and watch a movie with me? I don't want to talk about anything. Just these different ways of integrating in our nervous systems, in our story, in our minds.
Yeah. And back into relationships.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, how do we integrate these new senses of ourselves in our lives as they're constantly changing? Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. Yeah, and the sensitivity of all of that as a facilitator and someone who is holding these spaces. And again, as a facilitator, being just a fellow human, whether it's a friend, a colleague, parent, whomever, we're all facilitating, and the sensitivity around those transitions and experiences being so key. It's just whenever I am doing, say, another facilitation training or like therapist training, just always feels like training and just being a fucking good human, actually.
For sure.
Like what it means to be human together, to be with humans. It's kind of always just what it feels like. The training that we kind of never had.
Yeah.
But imagine the world if we did. Yeah. And we are.
We are, and we're very blessed. I feel very blessed, you know, to be able to have the privilege to explore my interiority and to really have the, you know, support and love of my parents, my family, and to be in this, like Australia, look at right now, like the world is, a lot of us falling apart with COVID. We're very blessed, very privileged. And so to also have that, that time and space. And as facilitators, we are bringing ourselves that. And it reminds me of, say, I've done, ever since I was in Boulder for some time, where you spent some time as well of deeply diving into rites of passage work and a lot of it movement, art-based. And I know for me, coming back here and offering some of that work myself, because I felt like it was really lacking. So of work spaces which support us to move through the messiness of transition and to create art with that in our lives, or, you know, to have a community or a sense of people holding our wings that help us to move into the next chapter, whatever that is. And for me as a facilitator, knowing that I need to be willing to go along with the ride, to be changed by this journey with everyone. Like, it takes a lot of courage to be in any kind of process. If it's a single conversation with someone who doesn't agree with anything you say or has a completely different viewpoint, look at, or to be in some process which might bring up all these emotions that you don't want. Like, for me, that fascinates me, because I also love this idea. I'm oriented a lot towards wholeness and wanting to seeing that. And also in my work, it supports me to be a better or more effective facilitator, and a more probably enjoyable partner or friend or son or brother. So it's not easy though, but it's a privilege. It also is a privilege, and I feel very blessed. To explore.
Well, I feel blessed to be sharing in the journey together, and there's so many tourist routes and things that we didn't get to go down, such as really diving into movement and the role of embodiment within facilitation, co-regulation, all these beautiful themes. And maybe we'll click record again another time, or maybe we'll just have more chats on the deck.
Maybe
possibly, maybe a kayak.
You could do a podcast on the kayak.
Yeah, sweet. I'd love to do that.
That moment when you hear the mic drop into the Yarrows.
Yeah. Wow, that'd be a great sacred pause. But as a way of, I suppose, closing, I'm curious about any resources that you would recommend people either beginning in facilitation, deepening in facilitation, or just people who just jam on these similar threads. What are your go-to writers, teachers in the space?
I love Glen Oker's work. She has a book called Getting Our Act Together. Really beautiful, simple, practical guide in facilitating as a whole person. And her work, I work for Groupwork Centre as well, so that's a kind of shameless plug. But some great work in regards to training. For me, education in training, experiential ways, really helpful. Resource, I'd encourage people who want to develop their facilitation to try coming to a dance, open floor, 5 rhythms dance floor, to go try meditating, or that's another resource for me. I also think I've been loving podcasts lately. It's so long, these resources are so they're so broad. Maybe, wow, what are the resources? I guess you can just cut these bits out, can't you? That's my broad sweeping things. I could probably share a couple if there's any other thing that comes to mind, but that's my broad resources. Come dance, sit in a circle.
Cool. Well, we'll put those links in the show notes for sure. Glen Oker's book.
I'll send you a few other links.
Group Work Centre.
We probably hit that point at the end of the day, and I'll say, they need to remember the memory with all the great books I've read and the podcasts I've listened to.
Yeah, and all I can think about is the dal that's ready to be warmed up, and the bath that's ready to be laid in. And,
comfortable, cozy mattress.
I feel so full after our conversation, as always. Thank you. Any parting words or gestures or things to listeners for this?
Such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. Parting words is, as a facilitator, is encouraging people to have a go, to know that it comes from a place of generosity of spirit, generosity of heart, to know that things will almost never, if ever, go as bad as your mind thinks it's going to be. And to really have a go and start by validating. Just start by validating yourself, validating the other. And just to have a go. The world needs more fearless facilitators with heart. So just go for it. Have a go.
Start by validating. I love that as a closing frame.
Beautiful.
So thank you.
Pleasure. Thanks.
What questions are still whirring inside for you? What landed and what rung loudly for you? Let's just take a moment. Thank you for joining me for another life-affirming, enriching conversation, each one a light, a torch to guide us on our path to being in right relationship with ourselves, those we walk with, and the ecologies we are very much a part of. I trust this has gifted you something to place in your toolkit to support you in your own journey and your leadership. Sitting here practicing and recording on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation here in Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, I'd like to pay my deep respects and thanks to their elders past, present, and emerging, and may this work, this offering, be a prayer for the remembrance, the renewal, and the reclamation needed to live in relationship with culture and country, as those who have been here for tens of thousands of years have done so powerfully. Also to acknowledge Brother Keenan from Rhone, whose beautiful music we are graced by in the intros and outros for the show. So thank you to Brother Keenan, and do check him out. Such sweet, reminding tones. And links to his platforms in the show notes. And do make sure to connect with me and leave any comments on my Facebook or Instagram page @ljeffrey_, and check out the links in the show notes. This show is completely funded by listeners just like you. So if you feel generous and wish to be part of nourishing these inquiries we're exploring, you can leave a once-off donation or soon subscribe to my community membership. All the show notes, resources, and donations are all at spacesbetweenpodcast.com. Until next time, beautiful one, we can't rush our way back. Notice the connections and tend to the sweet spaces between. Lots of love.